Alright guys, welcome to another video. In this one I'm going to be doing something that I've wanted to do for a while in Half Life Alyx, which was to kind of explore outside of your sort of, general vicinity of the levels that you're able to explore within VR. I figured this would be kind of a cool little, video of Alex's world, because there's a lot of really neat things in there. I felt, really generally just entrenched in that world as soon as I got in, because the art direction's incredible. The levels are beautiful. Now, those of you that didn't know, the kind of first level here, where you sort of, just hang out and you can see the menus and stuff. Normally in your VR headset, this is kind of how you go ahead and select everything. But you can walk around this whole area because it's actually a little map. Now, I don't know, sort of how much you can actually explore, how far you can go out, but we'll just sort of, take a nice little peek around here, and ideally I actually want to see if we can head behind that area over there. So hopefully, it looks like I didn't type that in all the way here, but should be able to now. So again, they've actually rendered, a fairly decent chunk here that you can kind of fly around and explore. Now, I'm guessing that not a whole lot of this is textured, and you can see the little menu hanging out over there. But generally, this is the main map. This is what you see when you sort of, get into the game and hang out, and you're sort of just facing in this direction, and they've got what looks like some kind of spotlight basically looking at this particular area here. But let's take a look at the next map here and see what's going on over there, because there are a lot of really beautiful sections to this game. Alright, so this is, of course, the intro level to Half Life Alyx, and it's absolutely stunning. I mean, when you first walk out in here, you just get to experience the grandeur of City 17 in a way that, really is impossible, I feel like, even in Half-Life 2. The only way you're really going to experience something like this, with Half-Life is if you play the Gary's Mod kind of VR version, or if ultimately people end up kind of backporting Half-Life 2 levels into this engine, which has been done recently by some people with at least the first level, so pretty neat that that might happen at some point in the future. Or, again, the Half-Life VR team may end up fully releasing their Half-Life 2 kind of version of this that's got the VR kind of implemented in it, but that wouldn't be running on Source 2, of course. It would just be running some slightly modified version of the engine. Now, again, I don't recommend playing the game in non-VR mode, but, should you choose to do so, again, you are more than welcome to. Definitely is a lot better still in VR than it is in 2D, but let's take a look at some of the areas around here and see just how much Valve has actually cut and how much you can kind of experience on your own. So here's that cat that you can kind of throw stuff at when you're just flying around. As you can see, immediately through this door, there's basically just complete emptiness. Now, you can actually kind of come down to the streets here and just sort of hang out, so we're going to do that right now, just so you can see sort of what's going on. But generally speaking, the characters are pretty lifeless. They don't interact with you. There's no sort of, clipping maps or, borders that will prevent them from doing anything. They don't have any guns. Although the models do look really, really great. And unfortunately, you never actually get to fight the Metro Cops in the game. Only the sort of heavier Combine soldiers. But you can see pretty much kind of right away that sort of the rear portion of the building is not actually being rendered, which is good for VR performance reasons. Oddly enough, they decided to still render the parts of these buildings that you still can't really see. Not really entirely sure why, but, it is what it is at the same time. It's just really cool to kind of be down in this area and see exactly how Valve kind of did things here with this, with this level in particular. This is a bus stop that you can see sort of, from the balcony when you come out. The interesting thing is that none of the characters actually have eyeballs. It's like, it's kind of creepy. They actually all are missing eyeballs. And, surprisingly, the level of detail on these characters is actually still relatively good, considering the fact that, they're just off over here and not really being used. They've recycled quite a few of them, but they just kind of walk around and do nothing pretty much most of the time. And then again, a giant hole right here. You can see some helicopters kind of flying around in the distance, but typically speaking, there's not a whole lot happening here, and it's kind of a shame because it would have been really nice to actually explore these streets. Instead, you kind of just get some occasional, kind of characters here and there, that are sort of littered, in the streets so that you can see what's happening. Again, this car is really just kind of floating off in midair. It doesn't even look like they bothered trying to correct the way it looks, but then again, you're probably not going to be seeing a whole lot of it anyway, so what difference does it actually make? Again, another kind of hole in this section right here, but by and large, you can see a pretty decent kind of rendering amount of this whole city. Again, I talked in my review of this game that they never really did too much to get you out onto the streets. Unfortunately, this is about as close as you're going to get to seeing what actually happens down in these levels, and so there's not kind of a whole lot that you'll get out of this, unfortunately. You'd think there'd be a little bit of an Easter egg here and there, but alas, this is kind of, pretty much everything that you get to experience here. So there's not a whole lot going on there either. Again, you can see in this room where you go into next afterwards, they've kind of just left out this whole portion of the walls, because again, you as a character, you're never going to see those, so what's the point of ruining the game's performance if there's really no reason to keep that area kind of rendered in your view. Now, the cool part is that, of course, the rooftops are still rendered properly, so you can kind of just fly around and check out the Combine architecture that's been kind of erected in the city. Again, you can see that some of the rendering in the engine is very interesting once you get to specific angles where it just decides to kind of not have that be permanent part of the world. I'm not sure what exactly this sort of technique is called. I'm guessing it probably has something to do with occlusion, to kind of make sure that you're getting consistent frame rates by not rendering the stuff that you don't actually need to see. And you can kind of fly towards the Citadel, but you can't actually go too high up in this level. You seem to get blocked right around this section. Potentially with some other console commands you could probably get past that. But again, in this section of the game, you basically just get to see this part of the Citadel. It's just still being built. Of course, this is 5 years prior to the death of the Eli Vance, so the Citadel is indeed, not completed at this stage. So presumably, at some point during those 5 years, it gets fully completed, and then we actually finally get to see sort of the fruits of Combine labor as far as that's concerned. But let's move on to another map here and see, kind of how things were done in that next level so that you can check out some additional pieces. Now, I believe that we can actually see another part of the map somewhere around here. I always keep forgetting exactly where it is, but eventually we'll find it. I just got to kind of tool around for a bit before we're able to see that section again. I don't believe that it's too far away from this sector specifically, but we should be able to find it and then be able to take a look at some kind of additional things that the engine has rendered out before. So this part is where you kind of come out from eventually. Now you can see here that there are a number of doors, a number of separate kind of different things. Now there is a Combine soldier in here that just kind of randomly runs and then checks, and typically you can see him from behind this fence, and that's kind of the extent of what you get to see in that section. There's also kind of another section over here that, again, we as the players, we don't get to explore, on our own, unfortunately. But this is a little laundromat section here where you can kind of hang out, and then eventually you see your friend, and she kind of just hangs out in this section right here. And then you have a bunch of Combine that kind of, just walk along this way. And, this is the character that you end up talking to here. Let's see if I can kind of slow myself down. And then you've, of course, got the Combine, again, just sort of hanging around in this area. But very cool because you normally don't get to see it from this perspective, so just being able to kind of mess around in this area is really cool. Again, the characters don't react to you at all, and as far as we're concerned, this is the closest you'll get to actually seeing the Metro Cops outside of the regular gameplay, because you just don't see them or fight them later on. Occasionally you can kind of see them from behind a fence here and there, but that's about as good as it's going to get as far as seeing the Metro Cops. So this is the map where you crash after the Combine truck here, and you can see that here is the little kind of drone that typically flies around and photographs you in Half-Life 2. Obviously, in Half-Life 2 they had a very kind of basic sort of view of these drones. Now, of course, you can see that they have become a lot more mechanical, a lot more complex, very cool looking. It looks like they potentially are powered by an internal combustion engine, which is also kind of interesting. You can see it's got a little bit of exhaust coming out there, potentially, explaining a little bit of how they actually work. And interestingly enough, they've also rendered quite a fair bit of road back here for some reason, which is odd to say the least. Then you have this really cool combine sign over here, which kind of turns on and off depending on kind of which section of the map you look from in here. And then you can see a little bit of Russian, or what looks like at least Cyrillic, over here on the billboard. And let's see if we can fly up towards the Citadel a little bit more. I'm going to guess that they probably block us yet again, but who knows? Possibly we might be able to get a little bit further. Yeah, so this time around still blocked off from getting closer, but you can see a little bit more of the Citadel in this case, as we're actually able to get a slightly closer look at the tower itself. Again, here is the map sort of from the top view, but of course, normally you don't kind of get to see that sort of layout because you're typically just kind of stuck sort of in the beginning stages of the map, etc. And it takes kind of a while to just progress through all these little different steps until you ultimately end up coming towards the area that you'll see in here, which is the playground. Of course, then you also see these little combine billboards here, once again, which are really cool. This is not really something that we got to see in Half-Life 2 from what I recall, or if we did, then they had a very basic layout. Again, really cool little combine, piece of architecture over here. And I believe that you can actually kind of take a look at the trucks that the combine used too, which from what I, again, remember of me playing Half-Life 2, these were never really there before, so pretty neat that you just get to see that around here. Let's see if looks like the combine soldier that used to be around here left, or potentially walked somewhere else. It's kind of hard to know for sure, and I'm not really entirely clear why they have this bridge over here, but nonetheless, that is over there, and you can obviously go over there to visit that. And here's the area where Russell, gives you the pistol, and ultimately also gives you, the headset along with a bunch of other things. So you can see his lab in here. He's not actually in here currently, but you get to check out the same kind of rooms that were in here before. And then obviously this is the room that you get into where you actually get your Russells. Now in here, here's a room that I've wanted to visit that I didn't get to visit in VR. Let's see if we can actually come out of Noclip on this one. See sort of the prototype Russells in here. I don't think I'm able to actually zoom in, but nonetheless, here they are. You've got the magnifying glass or light or something along those lines, and then you've got a, looks like schematic potentially, another microscope, PCB, and what looks like a graphics card from the 90s, potentially kind of telling you what setting this takes place in, unless of course this just happens to be still in the future, but in an alternate kind of dimension or timeline, so to speak. Let's kind of continue on here. Let's see what else we can figure out about this particular map, since it's still kind of a light map with a lot of various little sections that you can actually go through and visit as the player. Now, typically at this stage you get into the train and you continue through the level, and then it starts and loads up a new map. But let's take a look in here. Let's see what else we can find. Here's a crane that you get to see throughout the game. Now here we are taking a look at the drainage map, and it looks like one of the manhacks has decided to have its fun with me. But this kind of gets me to highlight one of the issues that I have with the game. As you can see, you're progressing through these series of rooms for the most part in the game for a good chunk of the level. Then you eventually finally get to kind of have a little bit of a breather until you ultimately, come up here to have a little bit of light and fight these zombies again. And it's actually going to be interesting to see if the manhacks end up attacking them or not. Looks like they don't really interact with the zombies at all, which is kind of interesting. You would think that the Combine would fight the zombies, but I guess that's not really quite the case. Although nonetheless, kind of interesting to see what the AI is up to when pretty much nothing's kind of happening, but yet the player is still in view. It looks like they may potentially occasionally crash into each other, but I don't think the manhacks are actually doing any real damage to the zombies. But regardless, you can again see that it's not long afterwards that you end up again going into a really dark area and then spending quite a fair amount of time, progressing through the darkness for, again, very long periods of time before you're able to see the sunlight again. You can see that there are only brief portions of this level where you actually get to be out and about in the kind of open air, and then after that you immediately get to go back into darkness and using your flashlight, etc. Again, the crane model makes a reappearance once more. They seem to be really big fans of that one, and the manhacks are still after me in this particular section. Nonetheless, again, another gorgeous level that really gets to highlight the features of the engine, and as well as the physically based materials that have been used on, pretty much everything from barrels to metals to concrete, making everything just look that much shinier. Unfortunately, the textures don't always kind of live up to, your high standard expectations of a game in 2020, but again, you got to remember that this is a game that's in VR, so performance is definitely paramount. You don't want to overload your graphics card with unnecessary VRAM usage or anything else, because you're going to be rendering things twice, once for each eye. Now, this next map, appropriately named Pistol, is the one, as you can see, which is arguably the most linear map of, all of the layouts, because you start out up here, then you kind of walk out into this area where there's a zombie banging his head, and then you get to see this really cool section here, which, looks like for the first time we actually get to see what appears to be either tessellation or parallax occlusion mapping of some kind being witnessed in this engine, which is pretty neat because the Half-Life 2 version of the engine that, released, and I think even to this day, doesn't really have those sort of features. They did do parallax mapping, but those objects aren't able to self-shadow, which is the difference, of course, between that and Palm. But nonetheless, you can see kind of a bunch of things can happen here. Interestingly enough, if you actually no-clip in here and take these barrels, you can still feed them to the barnacles and have them explode, which is kind of a neat little thing, because for the most part, you aren't able to interact with objects in this world a whole lot. I mean, you can kind of press stuff and, it kind of works, but by and large, you're not going to see, a whole lot of this sort of level of interactivity from, most of the other kind of objects in the game, unfortunately. So one of those rare moments where you do actually get to experience the game as, you would typically, but again, as I was saying before, by and large, this is not something that you're actually capable of doing otherwise. For the most part, you're kind of just able to fly around, and that's basically the extent of your sort of ability to do anything. Now, the interesting part is that if you end up using the impulse cheats in this game, you're actually able to get yourself quite a decent amount of ammo. You can also do a bunch of different sort of commands that were still available in the old engine, interestingly enough, but you're able to just basically use weapons, which is kind of interesting. Of course, playing the game like this is not really a whole lot of fun, and I absolutely don't recommend it. Interestingly, if you do decide that you want to kind of do it this way, there are actually Half-Life 2 models and even kind of updated models that you can use from other titles, and specifically also the Steam Workshop, where you can kind of pick up the models and replace the ones that are in the game, which are non-existent here because this isn't the preview build anymore. This is running the retail release, so surprisingly, a lot of this actually still works, and interestingly enough, you can still kind of pick stuff up a la Half-Life 2, but it's not really going to be very efficient or particularly fun doing things this way. Once again, this is not kind of the way that you want to be playing this. It's really not ideal. But the cool part is you get to see sort of the way that the models react to gunshots, and the way that pretty much everything in the world is interacting with the bullets, specifically the physics. I don't really know how I feel about them in this game. They definitely have done a good job of implementing their own physics system in here, but to say that it's necessarily better than Havoc, I don't know if it really is. It's just kind of cool to be able to walk around these areas and just sort of destroy everything. So this one's going to be kind of familiar to you if you've played the game. If you haven't, go ahead and play it and don't do what I'm doing. But nonetheless, this is a really cool level because typically you're kind of just stuck down here looking up. But actually, if you take a closer look at some of these buildings here, you can see that this is an area which really suggests that, basically Earth had a really hard time with finding off the, Combine. I almost said Covenant there. But you can kind of see that a lot of these buildings have taken on quite a significant bit of damage. Now, I'm not sure if they've actually rendered a whole lot past some of these areas. I guess they actually have, but it almost looks like they've covered some of the buildings up, either because this is a quarantine section or, because something else has happened. But you can also kind of see that there's potentially fires that have been going on and raging inside these buildings. There's kind of charring that's happened on the outside. And these are details that you sort of lose when you're playing the game in VR, because you don't really get to see that far and actually see that sort of damage. I mean, you can kind of see it, but you don't really get to actually witness it up close. Interestingly enough, this little section here, which was pretty common in Half-Life 2, also makes a return. I guess it's almost kind of like in Overwatch Tower, if you will. And here we have the train yard, where you can kind of just go around and explore various little bits and sections of the level, and ultimately you can kind of come across really cool sections before coming back. And then you can see in here that this is the area which actually opens up the tunnel that you will proceed into at some point later on. Now, initially you don't really get to see a whole lot of that, and the game doesn't really render everything out, but nonetheless, very beautiful area, and expertly rendered as well. Looks absolutely gorgeous. Definitely really cool just being able to mess around and fly around in this world, versus being constricted to just walking around plainly. But hopefully at some point somebody's going to take some of these kind of assets and actually backport them to Half-Life 2, so we can have some really cool things to kind of play around with in Gary's mod, etc. Unless they end up releasing Gary's mod with the Source 2 engine, of course, which would also be pretty neat. And here we can see a pretty crappy texture of rocks. But again, you're not really going to be looking in there anyway, so who cares? I'm surprised that they actually had that render out at all. But very also, neat look at the zombies. They made them look very grotesque, to the point where they almost look like something you'd see in Doom or something along those lines. And some pretty crazy rendering on the body parts that are sort of hanging out from them. And interestingly, they've actually got different models for different characters, which is also pretty cool. Here we can take a look at the train yard level, which you can see the Combine are probably going to kill me unless I actually put God mode on, because they still treat me as an enemy, which I suppose kind of makes sense. I was really hoping that we'd be able to just get to see that Combine soldier killing the zombie, but I guess not in this case. Well, let's see. Here's some more Combine who are apparently not doing a whole lot at fighting the zombies, except for these guys. And then they decide to go and fire on me because, hey, that's just how that works. Let's see if this guy ends up dying. And he actually just might. Oh, there he goes. He's a goner. And immediately as he dies, it looks like his rifle disappears too. Which is kind of a shame, because they actually look really cool, and as do their rifles. Interestingly, it looks like the AI kicks right back in as soon as they start doing this stuff. And you can see that, there's some code left over from Half-Life 2, because they respond in almost very similar fashion to the AIs from Half-Life 2, which I guess is in some ways both a good and a bad thing. Another cool part is you can see the inverse kinematics at play here, as the Combine's soldiers' feet are stepping differently on unlevel terrain versus level ground. Another really kind of cool portion about this. And, this is another great level design, ultimately. I mean, while, again, you're kind of stuck for the most part, sort of just messing around in various little bits and pieces here, just flying around back here gives so many great Half-Life 2 vibes that it's just crazy. And even though you only get to play just kind of a slice of this map, versus kind of in other maps where it's, in Half-Life 2, for example, a lot more open, you got to remember that they had to kind of constrain this so that you could actually play it properly on, various levels of hardware. And even then, you still occasionally get hitching, unless you're running something like a 2080 Ti. You're still going to have some issues with running the title unless you do have, sort of more modern hardware, more powerful hardware. And here we've got the processing plant level, which is a really cool level because it's actually, at least a little bit more open than some of the other areas, especially when you finally kind of get into combat here. Again, this was the area that they've shown off in the trailers, I believe, quite a good number of times. And ultimately you get to see the Combine prison here, which I'm not going to spoil anything, but very cool area here. Ultimately looks incredibly great. Then you've got some other kind of inside areas that you end up visiting. They're not really super interesting. And then you have, a couple of other sections here where once again you're going to be kind of, running into various different Combine soldiers as you, run into different patrols, etc. And ultimately you can see that there are, here's one guy who's just kind of flying around and he's probably going to try and shoot me. And they've got a bunch of other Combine soldiers in here as well. It looks like, I guess this guy actually finally spawned in too, which is kind of interesting. I didn't expect that they would end up coming into this area, but let's just go ahead and turn this on here so that the AI aren't going crazy on me because they're ultimately shooting. But once again, this area looks really great, and the interesting part is that they've actually kind of taken a slightly different approach to some of the buildings here. While some of them, are still kind of recognizable, they've got, this weird Combine stuff hanging off of it, potentially antennas, we don't really know for sure. And then you've got this other building which is supplying, looks like power to the flying ship here, the Combine ship, really beautiful. Strangely enough, the Combine ship is fully rendered from this side as well, even though you never actually get to go back here and explore that area. And then for the most part, a large chunk of the map continues being rendered, even when you're kind of flying around in this section, although it could just be because I'm flying through it. It may be that when you're actually in, these sort of internal areas that it's culling all of that out. I'm not sure how Source 2 does this, and we probably won't find out until we actually get the Source 2 SDK to kind of figure out how aggressive the engine actually is at doing this kind of stuff. But nonetheless, again, really gorgeous lighting in this level. Probably one of the few levels where you get to be outside during dusk, and it looks, just absolutely spectacular.